What if I told you that the greatest enemy a man faces isn't external at all? That beneath the surface of masculine strength lies a shadow so devastating that it silently destroys millions of men from within? The fear of failure doesn't just hold men back, it slowly kills something essential inside them, something that once lost may never return. In the next minutes, I'm going to reveal the dark psychological truth that society refuses to acknowledge about men's deepest fear. A revelation so profound that understanding it could transform how you see yourself or the men in your life. This is not comfortable content, but it's the raw truth that might finally make sense of the quiet desperation you felt but couldn't name. Stay until the end. What I'm about to share is not just information, it's illumination in the darkest corners of the masculine psyche. The modern man walks a precarious tightrope, balanced between two abysses. On one side lies the void of failure, a darkness that terrifies him more than death itself. On the other, the crushing weight of expectations he never chose to carry. And with each passing year, this tightrope grows thinner, the winds stronger, the fall more certain. Look around you. Behind the composed faces of men in your life, fathers, brothers, partners, friends, exists an invisible war. A battle not fought with weapons but with the soul itself as both battlefield and prize. The fear of failure doesn't simply discourage men, it colonizes their inner world until the authentic self becomes unrecognizable even to them. This fear has ancient roots. Throughout human history, male status has been intrinsically tied to performance, achievement, provision. A man who failed wasn't just unsuccessful, he was unworthy. When early human tribes faced starvation, the male who couldn't hunt became not just useless, but a liability. This primal coding runs deeper than conscious thought. It's embedded in the masculine psyche as an existential terror. But in today's world, this ancient programming has mutated into something far more insidious. The modern man doesn't face simple threats like starvation or predators. Instead, he navigates a complex labyrinth of social expectations, economic pressures, and identity crises that his ancestors never imagined. Success isn't clearly defined, yet failure remains absolutely forbidden. This contradiction creates a wound in the masculine soul that never properly heals. Consider this. When a boy first encounters failure, something profound happens in his psyche. If that failure is met with shame rather than guidance, a fateful split occurs within him. The authentic self, vulnerable, honest, uncertain, becomes unsafe, dangerous, a liability to be hidden away. In its place arises what Carl Jung would call the persona, the social mask designed to protect against the unbearable pain of rejection. This mask becomes increasingly sophisticated with each passing year. The teenage boy learns to hide uncertainty behind bravado. The young man discovers that vulnerability is punished while stoic performance is rewarded. By adulthood, many men have perfected this masquerade so completely they've forgotten it's merely a performance. The mask has become fused to their face. But the authentic self doesn't disappear. It retreats into the shadow, that repository of disowned qualities Jung identified as crucial to psychological understanding. From this darkness, it calls out in moments of quiet desperation. This is the voice men hear in their lowest moments, when they wonder if any of their achievements matter, if anyone would truly care if they vanished tomorrow. The tragedy isn't just that men fear failure, it's that they've been conditioned to believe they are their performance. The masculine identity becomes so entangled with external metrics of success that the question, "Who am I if I fail?" becomes existentially terrifying. Because the honest answer, buried beneath layers of conditioning, is, "I don't know." This fear manifests in patterns so predictable they become invisible. The workaholic who cannot rest, the father unable to admit uncertainty to his children, the partner who withdraws rather than discussing financial stress, the friend who responds to emotional conversations with jokes or advice, never revelation. These aren't character flaws. They're survival mechanisms deployed against an unwinnable war. And what makes this war truly unwinnable is its impossible standard: perfection without vulnerability, excellence without risk, strength without weakness. These contradictions create a psychological double bind that slowly strangles authentic masculine expression. The cost of this conflict isn't theoretical. It's painfully real. Men lead in statistics of suicide, substance abuse, violence, and isolation. Not because masculinity is inherently flawed, but because authentic masculinity has been replaced with a performance so exhausting it eventually breaks even the strongest spirit. Behind closed doors, in rare moments of honesty, men confess a truth society doesn't want to hear. They're exhausted. Not just physically tired, but soul-weary. Drained from decades of performing a role rather than living a life. From pretending to have answers when they're filled with questions. From acting invulnerable when they feel anything but. Jung observed that the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For the modern man, this acceptance seems not just terrifying, but impossible. Because accepting oneself means acknowledging limitations, uncertainties, and failures, the very things men have been conditioned to reject at all costs. This rejection creates what Jung called a complex, an emotionally charged constellation of thoughts and feelings around a central theme. The failure complex in men operates like a black hole in the psyche, collapsing inward with such gravitational force that it distorts everything around it. Career choices, relationships, identity, all become warped by this singular fear. Consider how many men choose careers not from passion, but from fear. How many stay in soul-crushing jobs because the alternative, the unknown, the risk of failure, seems worse than certain misery. This isn't rational calculation but psychological compulsion, driven by the terror of being seen as inadequate. In relationships, this fear creates equally destructive patterns. The man who cannot bear to be seen failing often cannot bear to be truly seen at all. Intimacy requires vulnerability, yet vulnerability feels indistinguishable from weakness. So he creates distance, emotional, sometimes physical, to maintain the illusion of control. He loves, but always conditionally, always with a part of himself held in reserve, protected against the possibility of rejection. And as he ages, this fear doesn't diminish. It transforms. The young man fears he won't achieve enough. The middle-aged man fears losing what he's gained. The older man fears his life has been wasted on achievements that ultimately meant nothing. Same fear, different masks. What makes this dynamic especially tragic is that it's self-perpetuating. The more a man fears failure, the less willing he becomes to take authentic risks. The fewer risks taken, the fewer opportunities for genuine growth. Without growth, his authentic self remains undeveloped while his persona, that social mask, grows increasingly dominant. The split widens until he becomes, in Jung's terms, alienated from his soul. This alienation expresses itself in countless ways. Some men become trapped in compulsive achievement, constantly seeking the next promotion, the bigger house, the more impressive accomplishment, never satisfied because these external markers cannot fill an internal void. Others retreat into distraction, whether through substances, entertainment, or empty pursuits, anything to quiet the voice that questions their worth. Most disturbing is how this fear reproduces itself across generations. Fathers, unable to reconcile with their own fear of failure, often unconsciously ensure their sons inherit the same wound. Don't cry. Man up. Failure is not an option. These aren't just phrases, but psychological programming that ensures the cycle continues. The father's unresolved shadow becomes the son's burden to carry. Jung would see this as the repetition compulsion, the unconscious tendency to recreate familiar patterns even when they cause suffering. Until made conscious, this inheritance passes silently from father to son, an invisible legacy more powerful than any material wealth. But consciousness is precisely what's lacking in our cultural understanding of masculinity. We discuss symptoms, toxic behaviors, emotional suppression, resistance to vulnerability, without addressing the root cause, the profound fear that a man who fails is a man without value. This fear isn't just psychological, it becomes physiological. Research shows that status threats activate the same brain regions as physical pain. For many men, the prospect of failure triggers a neurological response nearly identical to being physically attacked. Their bodies enter fight or flight, flooding with stress hormones, making thoughtful response impossible. What looks like anger or withdrawal is often thinly disguised panic. What's truly insidious about this fear is how it isolates. Men suffering under its weight believe they're uniquely flawed, that other men somehow naturally possess the confidence, clarity, and competence they themselves are merely pretending to have. This perceived isolation compounds the problem, making authentic connection even more difficult. The reality? Nearly every man carries this burden. The difference isn't presence or absence of fear, but awareness of it. Some men remain unconscious of this dynamic their entire lives, wondering why achievement never brings lasting satisfaction. Others glimpse the truth in moments of crisis, job loss, divorce, health scares, when the persona can no longer maintain its protective illusion. Those rare men who face this fear directly discover something revolutionary. Failure isn't fatal to the authentic self, only to the false persona they've constructed. What dies in failure isn't the man himself, but the illusion that perfection was ever possible or necessary. Jung called this process individuation, the integration of disowned aspects of the self into a more complete whole. For men, individuation necessarily involves embracing the possibility of failure not as a catastrophe, but as an inevitable aspect of genuine living. Only then can the masculine soul begin to heal. But our culture offers little support for this healing. Instead, it sends contradictory messages. Be vulnerable, but never weak. Take risks, but never fail. Be authentic, but ensure that authenticity is socially acceptable. These paradoxical demands don't ease the burden. They make it ultimately unbearable. The path forward isn't simple. Jung understood that transformation requires confronting the shadow, those disowned aspects of ourselves too painful to acknowledge. For men, this means facing the possibility that their worth isn't determined by performance, that failure doesn't define them, that vulnerability isn't weakness but courage in its most profound form. This confrontation happens not through achievement, but through surrender, not through perfection, but through acceptance of imperfection, not through control, but through willingness to exist in uncertainty. These aren't merely philosophical positions, they're psychological necessities for authentic masculine development. The men who navigate this territory successfully discover something revolutionary. When they no longer fear failure completely, they paradoxically become more capable of genuine success. Not the hollow success of external validation, but the substantive success of meaningful contribution aligned with authentic values. They learn to distinguish between failure as an event and failure as an identity, between taking risks and being reckless, between vulnerability that fosters connection and disclosure that seeks rescue. These distinctions aren't semantic. They're essential for reclaiming masculine vitality from the shadow of fear. This reclamation begins with a question few men dare to ask themselves honestly. Who would I be if I could never succeed again? The initial response to this question is often terror, a glimpse into the abyss of non-identity that feels like psychic death. But beyond this terror lies something unexpected. Freedom. Freedom from performance as the sole measure of worth. Freedom from the exhausting maintenance of a flawless facade. Freedom to exist as a man defined not by what he achieves, but by who he fundamentally is. This freedom doesn't come easily. It must be repeatedly claimed against internal resistance and external pressure. Jung observed that The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. For many men, this privilege seems like an impossible luxury, even a dangerous indulgence. The fear whispers, if you show who you truly are, you'll be rejected. If you acknowledge your limitations, you'll be replaced. If you stop achieving, you'll disappear. These whispers aren't irrational in a culture that has consistently valued men for utility over humanity. That has celebrated male sacrifice while pathologizing male vulnerability. That has defined masculine success in terms so narrow that most men inevitably experience themselves as failing regardless of their accomplishments. But what if this culture is wrong? What if the masculine soul requires something more nuanced than relentless performance? What if men are deserving of compassion not for what they achieve, but simply because they exist? These aren't theoretical questions, but urgent psychological inquiries with profound implications. Because the crisis of masculine identity isn't merely personal, it's collective. As Jung recognized, the individual psyche both shapes and is shaped by the collective unconscious, that reservoir of shared psychological patterns that transcend individual experience. What we're witnessing in modern masculinity is a collective shadow emergence, the return of everything denied, suppressed, and rejected about masculine vulnerability and limitation. This shadow doesn't disappear when ignored. It grows more powerful, more destructive in its unconscious expression. We see this destructive potential in statistics too painful to ignore. Male suicide rates 3 to 4 times higher than women's. Substance abuse, violence, often directed at others, sometimes turned inward. These aren't moral failures, but psychological emergencies, symptoms of a masculine soul in profound crisis. The path toward healing requires something our efficiency-obsessed culture resists: dissent. Deliberate engagement with failure, limitation, and uncertainty, not as enemies to be conquered, but as teachers to be heeded. This dissent isn't weakness but initiation, the psychological equivalent of ancient rites of passage that transformed boys into men through encounters with symbolic death. In practical terms, this means men must learn to fail consciously, to experience limitation without self-abandonment, to encounter inadequacy without shame becoming identity. These skills aren't naturally developed in a culture that equates masculine value with performance. They must be deliberately cultivated against powerful resistance. This cultivation begins with recognition, naming the fear not to defeat it, but to enter into relationship with it. "I am afraid of failing" becomes not an admission of weakness, but an act of profound courage. Because in this admission, a man acknowledges both his humanity and his conditioning, taking the first step toward freedom from both. From recognition comes the more difficult practice of exposure, deliberately encountering small failures while maintaining connection to intrinsic worth. This isn't masochism, but inoculation, building psychological resilience against the catastrophic thinking that makes failure seem worse than death itself. As this resilience grows, something remarkable happens. The masculine soul begins to expand beyond the narrow confines of performance into realms of authentic expression previously deemed too risky. Creativity without guarantee of recognition, connection without certainty of reciprocation, contribution without assurance of success. These become not just possibilities, but necessities for a life fully lived. Jung understood that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. The implications are clear. Men who cannot reconcile with their fear of failure inevitably pass this burden to their children, perpetuating psychological wounds across generations. Breaking this cycle requires not just individual healing, but cultural transformation, a collective willingness to value men for their humanity rather than merely their utility. This transformation begins with a simple but revolutionary act: compassion for the masculine struggle. Not dismissal, not derision, but genuine understanding that the fear, destroying men from within, wasn't chosen but inherited. A psychological legacy as real as any physical trait. With compassion comes possibility, the possibility that men might define success not by achievement, but by authenticity, not by power, but by presence, not by control, but by courage in the face of uncertainty. These alternative definitions don't weaken masculine identity but deepen it, connecting men to sources of meaning more substantial than external validation. The ultimate paradox is this: what men fear most, failure, contains precisely what they most deeply need: liberation from the exhausting performance of invulnerability. In failure's embrace, the masculine soul finds not destruction, but differentiation, separation from false identities, and reconnection to authentic being. Jung would recognize this as the integration of opposites, the reconciliation of strength and vulnerability, certainty and doubt, action and receptivity. This integration doesn't happen through intellectual understanding alone, but through lived experience of falling and rising, breaking and mending, losing and finding oneself in the process. For the man caught in failure's grip, this may seem like cold comfort. The pain of falling short, of being seen as inadequate, remains achingly real. But within this pain lies an invitation to discover that beyond the fear of failure exists something more powerful: the possibility of living from a place of genuine authenticity rather than perpetual performance. This possibility represents not the death of masculinity, but its evolution, from a construct built on external validation to an embodied experience of internal integration, not weakness, but wholeness, not surrender, but transformation of what success itself means. The question becomes not how can I avoid failure, but who am I beyond success and failure? Not how can I prove my worth, but what if my worth exists independent of proof? Not how can I appear invulnerable, but what becomes possible when I embrace my fundamental vulnerability? These questions don't diminish masculine power. They redirect it from maintaining illusions to manifesting authenticity, from surviving to truly living, from existing in perpetual fear to engaging with genuine purpose. The fear of failure that destroys the masculine soul can become, when consciously encountered, the very doorway to its liberation. Not through conquest, but through relationship. Not through denial, but through integration. Not through perfection, but through the courageous acceptance of fundamental imperfection. In Jung's understanding, this acceptance isn't resignation, but the beginning of genuine individuation, becoming the particular person you were meant to be, rather than the generic ideal you were conditioned to imitate. For men, this individuation necessarily involves making peace with the possibility, indeed the certainty of failure, not as catastrophe, but as essential teacher. What awaits beyond this peace isn't weakness, but a strength more substantial because it's no longer dependent on external validation. A masculinity defined not by what it achieves, but by how authentically it engages with both success and failure as equally valuable aspects of a life fully lived. If something in this message resonates deeply with you, if you recognize this fear in yourself or someone you care about, share your thoughts below. This conversation about masculine fear isn't just important, it's urgent, because beneath the silence, beneath the performance, beneath the masks men have learned to wear, exists a profound longing not just to succeed, but to be truly seen. Not just to achieve, but to genuinely live. The journey from fear to authenticity begins with a single step: acknowledging that the fear exists. That step, seemingly small, contains within it revolutionary potential, not just for individual healing but for collective transformation of what masculine identity can become. What part of this resonated most with you? What would become possible if men no longer defined themselves solely through achievement? Share your perspective below, because this conversation, difficult as it may be, might be the beginning of something essential: the reclamation of the masculine soul from the fear that has held it captive for far too long.